Testing.
Hello. Nice to see you. Nice to how you doing? Yes, made it in the same place at the same time. It's incredible.
Yeah. James, wait, Tim, meet James.
Yeah.
Are you actually here for the weekend or just for this?
We've been in for a no. Oh, yeah, no, super. Going back onto this. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. A warm welcome to St. Paul's Clifton. I hope that you've already got a mug of something nice and toasty, and that you've already had something to eat. If you'd like to make your way over to take up a pew, and once we're all sitting comfortably, I'll do some further introductions. St. Paul's isn't the warmest church in Bristol, but I hope it's the warmest church in Bristol, if you know, or one of them, if you know what I mean. It's such a delight to welcome all of you this afternoon. Open Table Bristol, which we're delighted to host here, jointly hosted by St. Paul's and Cotton Parish Church in partnership with Victoria Methodist, our friends and neighbours, is only 3 months old, which is therefore why this afternoon is such an encouragement to recognise that the network is already well established, and we know that Open Table Bristol is in a way thriving on the coattails of the Open Table network, and also other more local LGBTQI Christian networks within the city, particularly Christians at Bristol Pride. So however you heard about this afternoon, whatever network you feel has been the tributary that's led you here, it's really lovely to see you all. It's a great delight to welcome Charlie Bell. A number of us have been encouraged and inspired by Charlie's writing. His book, Queer Holiness, just by its very title, was something of a publishing stir and storm. But for those of us who have read it and really been inspired by its thinking, we recognise that that queer is one of the best things that we can say about God, because God queers our lives and therefore leads us into life. And I don't want to steal Charlie's thunder by saying any more than that, but Charlie, just to say thank you so much for the clarity and conviction of your inspiration. And thank you so much for responding to the invitation to come and be with us and talk about your book and all that lies behind it. So I hope you feel the warmth of our welcome and gratitude this afternoon. Just to say that we're recording this, so we'll be able to share the talk back later on, and hopefully then you can share it more widely with your networks. And we hope very much that as well as being here for Charlie's talk, now you'll be able to stay for yet more mince pies and mulled wine, tea and coffee and other delights, and then stay on for our very special open table / Christians at Bristol Pride queer carol service, which is starting at 5, and lots more treats and delights within that. Just the last thing I want to say by way of introduction now, we've all got our favorite piece of Christian music. Perhaps we could do a straw poll later. Oh Holy Night is up there amongst mine, especially for the line, a thrill of hope, a thrill of hope. And that's what this afternoon is for me, a thrill of hope. Charlie, thank you.
Well, thanks very much. It's lovely to be with you. I'm sorry I'm sort of a bit away from you, but I need a lectern because otherwise I'll carry my iPad around and then it will get lost and it will be a disaster. So this is my attempt to try and keep myself in order as much as anything else. All we can do. Can we pull it down? Oh, okay. How exciting. Okay, shall I bring this?
Yes.
Oh, it's light. I shouldn't have said that. I should have pretended that was some cheap is the word, yeah. Lovely, thanks. Well, that's much better. So it's very nice to see you all. And thank you very much to everybody who was involved in the invitation. I won't try and remember exactly because I don't want to cause any trouble, but it's lovely to be with you. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the things I've been thinking about in my book, In Queer Holiness, not particularly because I want you to buy the book, although you should, because I get at least 10p from every book sale. So please do think generously and buy 2. But also because some of the things which I've thought about in the book are relevant to where we are now and where possibly the established church in this country is going. So I speak to you unashamedly as a Church of England priest. I was almost, well, there was an attempt to prevent my ordination in the summer. It failed, as we can see. Nonetheless, I do speak from a Church of England stable. So what I have to say is ultimately grounded in where we are as a Church of England. But that's not to say that the Church of England is the only church in town, as we know, quite literally and metaphorically. The thing is, I think it matters what the Church of England says, whether or not you turn up on a Sunday or whether you see yourself as Church of England or however you see yourself. Because if you want to get married in your parish church in this country, you have the right to do so, provided you haven't been married previously and provided that person is not of the same sex. So what the Church of England does on this matters because it impacts every single individual in the country. And so whether or not you are Church of England, you nonetheless, bad luck, have a bishop. And you can write to them and express how you feel. And that's particularly important at the moment for reasons that some of you, I'm sure, will be well aware of, and the rest of you I will make well aware of during this talk. So not only am I a Church of England priest, but I'm also a psychiatrist. So a lot of my work, and I continue to work as a psychiatrist in my day job. So a lot of what I'm thinking and the way that I address this topic is from a psychological perspective, or at least from a socio-psychological perspective, looking at institutions and as individuals as psychological entities as much as anything else. I'm also a gay person, and I frankly need to make a disclaimer, which is that for me, I have never, ever, ever, ever had a problem with being gay and a Christian. And I know that that's not the case for everybody. And I just need to put that out there because sometimes I go say things terribly blithely, as though, of course, but actually for many people, I recognize that this has been much more of a struggle. But for me, I've never had that struggle. So I just think it's important to make that clear. The first time I came across any challenge was when I realized I was probably gay, about the age of probably 12, 13, something like that. And I kind of thought, oh, okay, that's annoying. And thought, well, that's going to be a bit tricky for the next X number of years. And, you know, did the whole kind of, you know, talking to God thing, maybe you could take this away, but not particularly because I thought God thought it was bad, but just because it was quite annoying and it would have been much easier not to be gay and everything else was kind of ordinary. And I had all my privilege in a bag and I was quite happy to hold on to it, really. And then this happened and I thought, oh, for goodness sake. So I never really thought God had a problem with it. I still don't happen to think that. But then I came across at school, the Christian Union, who told me that God very much did have a problem with it. I went to a barbecue. I'm afraid I'm a sucker for free food. And so I went along to a church, sorry, not a Church of England barbecue. It certainly was not that. I went along to a Christian Union barbecue and I was told, we had lots of interesting talks about God and things. I thought that's fantastic. But underlying all of this was this understanding that God really did not think that you should practice homosexuality. That was the phrase used. Some of us don't need to practice. But I found this fascinating because I thought I'd never heard of anything like this. And I grew up in a church school. I was a chorister in Chichester. I grew up very much steeped in the church, steeped in the rhythms of the Church of England, in morning and evening prayer, particularly evensong every day, singing 3 services on a Sunday, and I just had never heard it. Which interested me, and interests me because one of the things which I think I've identified in the last couple of years of thinking about this stuff is quite how much is still unsaid, and yet the impact, nonetheless, of the overarching policy of the Church of England and the way that it behaves towards individuals may not be said, but is nonetheless there. And I think as I became more and more, unfortunately, dragged towards ordination, the more and more this became clear, and the more and more this became clear as to how it was going to impact me. So I've said I'm a Church of England priest, I'm a psychiatrist. One of the things I'm not is married. And the reason that I'm not married is because if I got married, I would not be able to hold a license, or I certainly wouldn't be given another license. I'm a curate, which basically means that you do everything the vicar doesn't want to do. And so I'm at the very bottom of the pecking order in the Church of England in terms of ordination. And I keep my license for the duration of that period of training. If I got married to my partner, I would not be relicensed. That would be it. Be game over. There are other things that the Church of England requires of its clergy, just to set the scene. The Church of England requires you to agree to a document called Issues in Human Sexuality, which was a pretty dire document in 1991, but my goodness, we have moved on a little bit since 1991. That has a few challenges in it. It says essentially that clergy must remain celibate, should show to prove an example to the laity, and that it's not compatible with Christian doctrine to do anything other than that. And we're expected to sign up to this, by the way, when we're ordained. And there are other interesting things within it. For example, a misunderstanding of what bisexual means, which I just find extraordinary. So Issues in Human Sexuality, this great document, this great teaching document of the church, seems to think that bisexuality means having sex with men and women at the same time. Not necessarily simultaneously, but nonetheless, being unable to remain faithful. So the Church of England's starting point for bisexuality is that it is a state of unfaithfulness, which is obviously untrue for anyone who has a brain cell. But also, the problem with this particular document is that it also seems to point towards elements of conversion therapy for bisexual people. They should meet with someone who could offer them counseling in order to learn or commit themselves to a form of Christian living, which inevitably means heterosexuality in this context. The other scary thing about Issues in Human Sexuality, and by the way, as I said, we're meant to sign up to this document, and it's the most up-to-date teaching of the Church of England. The other thing that it says is that if a gay gene were discovered, ethical questions would arise as to whether it should be eliminated. Now, I say these things because I actually think it's quite important to know what we're dealing with. So that's where we are. By the way, Issues in Human Sexuality, as far as I'm concerned, is on the way out. Hopefully in February, more of that or not. So that's where we are. As to be honest, as a gay priest in the Church of England, people ask me why I do it. I do it because I think that the gospel is true, that Jesus Christ was born, died, and was raised. That's why I do it. Am I sort of slightly crackers for continuing in the organization which I'm in? Probably, but there we are. There's many more questions to answer on that behalf. So I looked at the situation in the Church of England. As I said, I'd never had a problem with sexuality or with my own sexuality, certainly. And we could go to and fro over particular biblical texts that say one thing or don't say one thing, or perhaps say one thing, or maybe say one thing to one group of people, or however we want to see it. And I'm not going to do that today, and that was not my interest in the book either. What I was interested in doing was ultimately looking at the world, same-sex relationships as they are, not as the church would like them to be. And to say, if we look at this, if we look at the relationship, and I'm going to talk about two people of the same sex, two people of the same gender, if we look at people of the two people, it doesn't really matter what their sex gender is. If we look at those two people, but if we take it from the church's perspective, two people of the same sex, for example, can we really say there's nothing good in that? I mean, obviously the answer is no. But that's what the church is asking us to do. It's asking us, or the Church of England is asking us to institutionally say, there's nothing good in that. How do we know that that's what the Church of England is asking us to do? Because we're not allowed to bless same-sex relationships. We are forbidden, expressly forbidden. Just about 6 weeks ago, actually it's longer than that ago now, it just goes to show how time flies when you're having fun in ministry. I think about 8 weeks ago, maybe 12 weeks ago, possibly longer, one of our wonderful congregation members, who is in his late 80s, he and his partner have been together since, well, his husband were together since before it was legal. And his husband, for whom he'd been caring with just great diligence and dignity, died following a short but nonetheless difficult period of dementia. The first time I was allowed to pray for them specifically as a couple was when his partner had died. That is why I think we need change in the Church of England, to put it really bluntly. I would have been able to offer prayers for them. I would have been able to pray with them and the rest of it. But actually the Church of England's ruling from the bishops is you may not offer specific prayers for these individuals in the context of worship, and you may certainly not bless their relationship. So I thought that wasn't really on. Of course, I mean, we did anyway. I mean, come on. There are ways around these things, but that's the position in which we find ourselves. So we're being told we can't say there's anything good in same-sex relationships, which I think is just odd, to be honest. So I thought, well, let's have a look at what the church is doing and why the church is doing it. Now, I want to return to that idea of there being nothing good at a moment, because I think it's key to this whole question. The thing we're told is key to this whole question is sex. And it's a Sunday afternoon, and you probably had a nice lunch, so you can cope with this. So, one of the things which has always interested me, I was a medical student in Cambridge, and one of the things that we do in our second year is do human reproductive science, and you basically learn about the basics of human reproduction and genetics and the rest of it. So the first thing that really surprised me was how little people who were talking about this stuff from an ecclesial or a church perspective actually knew. So you'd have this conversation with people and say, okay, what is male? And they'd say, well, they say, okay, fine, what's genetically male? Let's just start with genetic male in terms of species. Wow, it's XY, we know that to be. No, it's not. It's not XY. In fact, the one thing that stops you being normal, i.e. female, the one thing that stops you being normal is a little region, a tiny little region, one single protein called the SRY region on the Y chromosome. And that little region, which is called a transcription factor, for those of you who are interested or feel like you need to know that, the SRY region is responsible for saying no to the female and allowing this odd male to develop. So by the way, female is the norm. No SRY, that's what happens. And that SRY can get broken, or it can get transposed. It can whiz its way across to a different chromosome. So you can be XX, and we're just talking about genetic sex here. We're not talking about anything else. Genetic sex. You can be XX with that little SRY region, one single protein, and that stops you developing female genetic sex. So you can be an XX male. You can also be an XY female, because that SRY region might be damaged on that, or it might not activate. So just from the very start, just thinking about the genetics, we're not even going into sociological or even into the anatomical sex questions here. We're talking about basic genetic sex. They didn't know what they were talking about, which is not great. And which is one of my key points, which is if we're going to talk about the world, if we're going to do theology, we need to do theology about the world as it is. We need to actually understand what we're talking about, which we don't. So that's number one. Then, of course, and we could go into this ad infinitum, as sex develops, then there are interrelationships between the transcription factors, those little proteins, hormones, and various other things that lead to the development of sexual characteristics, both internal and external, and so on and so on. And there is sexing of the brain, amongst other things. But we don't need to touch any of that, because the point is that if our starting point is that there is X or there's Y, then we're starting in the wrong place. So my next question then I was very annoying as a student. I'm still quite annoying, but I was really annoying. I said to one of my dear friends who absolutely opposed me on the idea that being gay and Christian was fine. By the way, being gay and Christian, by which I mean being gay and having a sexual relationship or having sex, being blunt. Because it's fine to be gay, but just don't, no. So the reason that I thought, but I think it's important. I think it's important to talk about sex, because actually we don't talk about sex enough. We just kind of talk in very sort of, well, it's friendship, and it's not friendship. If that's friendship, anyway, we'll come back to that. So I thought, well, let's have a think then about people who are intersex. I have a particular, one of my real interests when I was an undergraduate was thinking about the kind of biological, unusual biological outcomes, which therefore help us understand the more usual biology. It's very interesting the way that genetics, particularly in genes and things, that the way that that when we see slightly different genetics being expressed, we see different outcomes, and that gives us a better idea as to how what we would otherwise see working works, which I think is an interesting thing. So I said, well, okay, fine. If marriage is between a man and a woman, let's just accept your category error for now. But if marriage is between a man and a woman, what should people who are primary hermaphrodites do? And primary hermaphrodites, for those of you who did not do second year medicine, our primary hermaphrodites would be people who have the internal and the external, usually sex organs of both male and female, so usually one of each. It's very rare, but it happens. And I said, who should they marry? Let's obsess about marriage. Who should they marry? The answer? Well, they're an exception, so. If your theology labels people created in the image of God exceptions, your theology's got a problem. So I found that also deeply concerning, because I thought, well, not only do you not know what you're talking about, but even when we do explain what you're talking about, your theology just labels people as exceptions and therefore not something we should worry about. Wrong. So my next irritating question was, well, what is sex? And by the way, I mean sexual intercourse. Sorry. And the response usually, again, I didn't warn you, but I'm warning you now, this is getting graphic. Usually the response was something to do with penile vaginal intercourse. That's usually the outcome. That's what sex is. So my immediate response would be, for example, in a cis male couple, that ain't a problem. So that's not the issue here. We're talking about what the problem, man should not lie with a man as with a woman. Well, yeah, I mean, it ain't happening. It's not possible. Anyway, so that was then responded with, okay, well, that's, okay, it's not just that. There's something more to it. There's something that's sex that's beyond simply that. And we'd go to and fro trying to work out exactly what was meant. And eventually the outcome, because of course, various things are sexual and various things are sensual and various things are kind of both, or could be both. And eventually the answer that came to me from my unbelievably naive Cambridge chaplain was, sex is what you wouldn't do with a friend. Cambridge chaplain. I thought, my dear, you have not lived. But I really do think that is quite worrying from a university chaplain to come up with that as the answer. Anyway, but there's something true in that, in a sense. Because what's true in it is recognizing the contextual nature of sex. Not all sex, obviously. Some things are pretty cut and dry, but a lot of it isn't. So an example being, I spent a lot of my, when I was 18, 19, 20, going to visit our linked diocese. I was in Chichester and we had linked dioceses in Gambia, Cameroon, Senegal, etc. In Gambia, for example, just to take one example, if you walk down the street holding the hands of someone of the same sex, that ain't sexual. That's completely normal. There would not be sexual overtones to it. It would be bizarre if there were. I don't know what Bristol's like. I've only been here twice. But if you go into Bristol, I presume if you hold the hands of someone of the same sex, certainly men holding hands with someone of the same sex, that would be considered to be probably more likely to be sexual than not. It's probably fair. I don't know. As I say, Bristol might be, leagues ahead of London, but I don't think so. But anyway, that's what you'd expect. So which goes to show that that's not, so holding hands is not sexual. It's the context and the culture and everything else that speaks to, that gives meaning to those particular actions. The actions are not what matters necessarily, it's what they mean. My problem, therefore, is that what the argument against same-sex relationships actually is not about sex at all. It's about relationship. Because that physicality of holding hands, that the meaning, the contextual meaning that we give to those actions is talking about a particular type of relationship. Now let's just focus on monogamy. It's talking about a monogamous, intimate relationship between two people. That's a class of relationship. What we're saying then is that that type of relationship is not possible for people of the same sex. If we follow that through to its natural conclusion, if we follow it through from the sex is bad and the sex is cultural and contextual, and therefore we get to that position. We're not saying that it shouldn't happen, by the way. We're saying that it cannot happen. We're saying that that relationship cannot happen. Why? Because the relationship between two people of the same sex, or rather the relationships that we show, if we see them from a Christian perspective, would say that those relationships reflect something of the relationality of God. So Christian marriage, for whatever we might think that is, but marriage is reflecting something of the love of God for the church, the love of God for humankind, the love of God within the Trinity, or however we want to phrase it. What we're saying is, because those relationships should not be happening amongst people of the same sex, because God specifically says no, we are saying that people of the same sex, people who are gay or lesbian or bisexual are attracted to someone of the same sex. What we're saying is that those people cannot reflect that love in or with or from God. That's quite a big claim to make. I mean, it's absurd, but it's quite a big claim to make. But that is the claim that we eventually come back to if we follow through this idea, because we're saying that they are not able to express in and amongst themselves or with each other the same thing that straight people can by their nature. We are saying that by their nature, they are different. We are different. I find that very difficult to reconcile with a God that created each human being in his or in God's own image. That for me is very, very difficult to reconcile. And for me, I've not heard a convincing argument as to why people who are attracted to someone of the same sex cannot reflect God's love in the same way. I've heard all the biblical arguments time and time again, but I haven't heard that. So I said I'd try and keep myself 35 minutes, which I'm probably going to fail, but let's have a go. Just to give you a bit of a flavor of some of the other things which I thought about. So one of the really important things which I think the church has not grappled with, the Church of England has not grappled with, has been repression. Now, forgive me, because last time I spoke about this topic, I was airily talking about sociological and psychological theories, and afterwards a professor of sociology and a professor of psychology came up to me and I thought, oh crikey. So forgive me if this is all second nature to you. But repression is not a good thing. there are two basic ways. So if there are two things that we can do with information that we don't like or we don't want to process at this particular moment in time, and they form part of a panoply of defense mechanisms that we all embody and use all the time. But the two ones I want to think about are suppression and repression. And to think about them sort of in simple terms, suppression is, I don't want to deal with this, but I'll deal with it tomorrow and I'm aware I haven't dealt with it. Suppression. Repression is, and that's it. And that repression over time builds up into a very, very difficult internal milieu. Your internal psychological makeup becomes deeply, deeply damaged and damaging. The Church of England is an expert at repression. An expert at repression. Why? Because the Church of England has managed in some way to convince people that they should think in a particular way about themselves, whilst seeing that that does not make any sense. For example, thinking back to our idea of relationality, we've said, one, that the argument of the church is that people in the same-sex relationships cannot express what straight people can express in their relationships and are innately unable to express something of God, number one. Number two, if we say we cannot bless same-sex relationships, so the same-sex relationships are bad, not good, but they're bad because they might lead to temptation to sexual sin, a wonderful phrase. But they are bad. They are not something to be recommended, even though the church on the same time tells you must get into a civil partnership if you are a clergy person. Go figure. I don't know where that comes from, but that's where we are. But we're saying they're not good. We're saying they may not be blessed. We're saying they're bad. So if we say that, we must say that therefore nothing good can come from them. That relationship itself is not good. You cannot get good fruit after bad. The Bible's clear about fruits of the Spirit. So we're saying that you must believe that despite appearances, despite everything, that is not good for someone to enter into, because it will not give them good fruit. We know that's not true. We just simply know that's not true. You have to have one gay relative. You have to have, one trans friend. It doesn't matter. You have to have one person in your life to recognize that if you have your eyes open and your ears open, that is not true, which is a problem. And it leads us to this concept of cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is both my friend and my foe. I love cognitive dissonance because over time, it ruins the alternative argument. For example, you go to a church that tells you that homosexuality is sinful, and that same-sex relationships must be avoided at all costs, as a church in Cambridge says. Except your son comes out, at which point you love your son. You think, well, I want to love my son. Let's give this person the benefit of the doubt. They want to love their son, but they also want to hold what's going on in church. And over time, those two things become more and more and more difficult to hold. What happens? One of three things can happen. One is deeper repression. One of them is you reject the church. The other one is you reject your son because the cognitive dissonance becomes too strong. What we're asking people to do with that cognitive dissonance in the church is to repress it and repress it and repress it. So we end up essentially creating groups of people, clergy in particular, by the way, who live with repression, which is very deeply damaging both for them and for their engagement with other people. So we start off with repressed people. Then we think about what it does to the culture of an organization. And here I want to just talk about the Church of England for a moment, because I know it well. The Church of England, let's just take one example of the Church of England. I was just talking about this before the session, so forgive me for repeating something of what I said. One of the examples is to the Church of England bishops. Now, this matters to you because they are the people that set I was going to say policy. I think they call it doctrine, but who knows? But they set the direction and will do so in February. The Church of England has one gay bishop, according to the public record. I break no confidences in saying that that is not true. It is abundantly clear to anyone who has met Church of England bishops, let alone anyone who has ever had dinner with them, let alone anyone who has got to know them more than that there are more than one, or there is more than one gay Church of England bishop. I'm not going to out them because that's not what we should be doing. But it's known. So not only do we have hypocrisy because we pretend that they don't exist, but also when the one bishop who did come out, who, by the way, only came out because they were about to be outed by a national newspaper, when that bishop came out, how many of the other queer bishops put their hand up and said, oh, me too, 0? That doesn't sound like the Church of Solidarity that we're called to be, let alone anything else. So we have Church of England bishops who are too scared to say that they are also gay. That feels to me to be an unhealthy environment for the Church of England to inhabit. But why? What's going on here? Now, I think repression answers some. I think that repression is part of the answer. I think fear is another part of the answer. And in a sense, this debate tells us a lot about who we are as Christians, who we are as a church, that we have such fear around issues of gender and sexuality that we're unable to present our truths. We have our private lives and our public lives. One of the things I've been really keen to do since being ordained is just to be absolutely clear that there ain't a private life and a public life. So when people say, are you happy for me to film this talk? I'm like, yeah, because I won't say something. There's few things possibly I'd say in private that I won't say in public, but there's very few things, because as a public minister of the gospel, you are called to be accountable in all things. And yet we are firstly forced not to be clear, and those who do that enforcement themselves are not being clear and honest. There's a wonderful phrase, I will agree to obey the bishop in all things lawful and honest. What a marvelous get out. So we have bishops who won't say anything. We've spoken about fear, we've spoken about repression. The final thing is money. I really think it's important to talk about money. The reason that a large number of bishops sitting across the table from you will tell you that they won't support same-sex marriage or don't feel able to say in public what they feel much more able to say in private is that people will walk, and they'll walk with their money. The churches will walk with their money. Now, that may or may not be true, but why are we willing to be held hostage as a church, and why are we not willing to name it? If someone has said across the dinner table to you, if you do not do this, we will take our money away, they are blackmailing you, name them. Say, if we do this, St. Whoever's has said they will remove their money from the diocese. Just say it. But yet we've got to a place where we're unable to even be honest about those who blackmail us, which I think is really extraordinary. In the book, I've talked about vulnerability and power, about the way that this then impacts on our nature as a church, and the way that we interact with each other and the way that we interact with the world. And I think the way that we interact with the world is somewhere that I'd like to kind of draw things to a conclusion. For me, us becoming inclusive as a Church of England, and by the way, there are plenty of parishes, this one included, that are inclusive, but the structures matter. Reminder, it's your Church of England. The reason that I think it matters is because for as long as we continue to hold, harbor, and enforce homophobic and transphobic rules, we fail in our ability to speak in a prophetic sense to the rest of the world. And I don't think that's debatable. Why would anyone listen to a church that preaches about justice of various different kinds if it itself is unjust? That's pretty obvious. But maybe it's pretty obvious to me because I don't just work for the church. And I think one of the issues that we've ended up with is a church culture that doesn't recognize the wider world or what the wider world sees. I was just saying before this, if I said or wrote some of the things which are said and written to me when in church, if I wrote or said those in my day job in the NHS, I wouldn't be disciplined, I'd be sacked. If I just said them, you would not believe the stuff that I get. You might do, actually. You might do. It's extraordinary. And the power is constantly hiding behind this. The alleged similarity of having your sense of identity and self questioned, that's allegedly the same as having your theology questioned. That is not equal, and anyone that tells you it is lying. I mentioned in my sermon this morning, I think, about a cool heads and warm hearts, a phrase which I've heard many times. When I gave a talk at Darson Synod in Ely in 2012, something like that, when the most recent iteration of the facilitated conversations came out, when I was invited by the bishop to give a reply, which I did with joy, I read it back. It's not that hard really, and it's quite gentle. But there's a wonderful line where I said, "What do you think we get up to? Do you think we all just go and sit in our rooms, have loads of sex, and then do heroin?" And I think one of the people in the room thought, yes, that is pretty much what LGBT people do. That was a sort of norm. They were like, yep, all of those things, yep. But I remember giving that talk. And afterwards, someone put their hand up and said, "I just want to say to my dear brother in Christ that he should have a cooler head and a warmer heart." I ain't got a cool head about this, because none of us should have a cool head about this. And you're being gaslit if you're told to have one. So, to finish, two very brief things. One, where are we going as a Church of England? I'm happy to talk about that more in the questions, but I think we are slowly, like a sort of sad snail, making our way towards something like some kind of move. And I think finally we might be able to bless things which we already know are good. My favorite thing to say to people who oppose is, I don't care whether you call it marriage or not, God already calls it marriage, you're just taking ages to recognize it. That's what the church does. The church does not marry you, the church solemnizes your wedding. It recognizes your wedding. We don't marry anybody. We should always remember that. I don't know who we think we are. The final thing is, and the subtitle of the book, The Gift of LGBTQI People to the Church. I think the fact that LGBTQI people keep going to church is remarkable. What are we up to? It's quite strange, which must mean there's something important about all of this. That's not to say that I think that people who have been abused by the church or have faced untold aggression and being shouted down and the rest of it should stick with an institution which continues to beat them up. I don't think that's the case. For some people, it's right to leave. And by the way, that should make us think about our theology of salvation, our theology of meaning, our theology of membership of the church, our theology of the communion of saints, and. Because if the church is able to put people off to the extent that their life in all its fullness is more outside than inside, that tells us something about the church. So I think one of the gifts of LGBTQI people is turning up. There's always this good joke in South London in Southwark Diocese, if you got rid of all the gay clergy, there would be no clergy. I don't think it's that far from the truth. And certainly if you got rid of all of us and supporters and allies, that would be it. You could lock up shop. So I think it's amazing that LGBTQI people keep coming. I think that LGBTQI people keep holding the margins to the center in a way which we need to be alert to. And we need to be alert to this as we argue this and after we argue this and as we go on as a church. The margins are the center, the margins are in the heart of Christ. That's where the heart is. And therefore, we need to always check our own privilege as well. I hate chucking around these sort of buzzwords because then people get very upset when you mention privilege and things, but it's true. We need to be cognizant of our own privilege. I'm cognizant of the fact that if I wasn't gay, I would have it all. Yeah, I'm cis, I'm white, I'm male, I'm middle class. So we need to be cognizant of this. And we need to recognize that these battles, these arguments, these debates are not just about this, they're about power, they're about everything else that sits structurally within the church and within wider society. I think LGBTQI people give a gift to the Eucharist. I think when we go to Mass, when we go to the Eucharist, when we go to Holy Communion, We do not invite people to the table. The Lord invites people to the table. And when we sit round the table, or when we receive, however we do it in our own settings, when we go to receive the body and blood of the Lord, when we go to receive the bread and the wine consecrated, what we do is make a stand against those who say we are not created in the image of God in the same way that they are. The Eucharist is at heart a meal of solidarity of Christ with the church, with his people, but also of the people of God with the people of God. I think we offer the gift of honesty and courage. There are plenty of LGBTQI people who have faced coming out in a way which people who are not LGBTQI have no idea what that's like. The church could learn from that. It could learn from what it's like to feel like you are on the margin, to feel like you might not be accepted, quite like the Lord in Nazareth. So there are plenty of ways for us as LGBTQI people to give to the church. The problem is that the church needs to listen, and the church needs to recognize, the Church of England needs to recognize, and that some other churches have recognized, the Church of England needs to recognize that when we're challenging them, it's not because we necessarily hate the church, although, my goodness, some of us are frustrated. Even those of us who say Mass are frustrated. My goodness, we're frustrated. But we do it because we ultimately believe that the Christian message is enriched by what we have to say. It's enriched by the queer people in the pews, the queer people at the altar, the queer people even in mitres with croziers. And the church is only going to be enriched further when we're honest, when we're willing to see that as gift, and when we're not willing to hide that away in a way which ultimately degrades the life of God, degrades the Imago Dei in our fellow friends and companions in Christ, and degrades the church itself. I'll stop there.
Charlie, thank you so much. An absolute tour de force, not disappointing in any way, shape or form. I wonder if you put that on, and then we can use this one to rove around. I should have said at the beginning, the heating's just gone off, so I'll switch it on again, but we have got blankets. If you want to have more than your hearts warmed and your heads, then there's a plastic box at the back near the font where you can find a blanket. Don't be shy. But let's have some questions. Andy.
First of all, thank you so much. That was absolutely incredible. As somebody who has many times felt kicking and screaming dragged towards ordination and has reached the Church of England and many of the things you raised and thought absolutely not, I find it amazing that you're standing here giving this talk in a dog collar. So I'd just love to hear how you managed to reconcile just how bad it is with going and being part of it, because for me, I find personally, and no shade to anyone, I'd find that very difficult to have integrity and do that. And I believe you have integrity. So how have you done it?
Yeah, I hope I've got integrity. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I suppose actually integrity is the word. So for me, I have never lied. Well, I have lied, obviously. Like I lied when I was a child. I probably lied recently, but I haven't lied as regards this. I have never said something to a bishop or to a member of whoever's been putting me through that was dishonest as relates to sexuality. That may be because I've never been asked the question or certain questions, but I have also had very supportive people who know that they are willing to take that fall rather than ask me to take the fall. If I'm honest, I ask myself exactly the question you just asked all the time. And I was actually just asking it to myself yesterday afternoon for a variety of reasons. I don't think if I didn't see a genuine chance of change coming, that I could have got ordained priest. I tried to run away from ordination a lot, and gave lots of reasons why it couldn't happen. including, by the way, being kind of openly, I was the chair of the LGBT Society at Cambridge, for goodness sake. So I tried my best to ensure that there would be enough letters that ensured it didn't happen. And unfortunately, it did. But I think it's really difficult. But I think actually holding that tension is both quite destructive for one's own internal ego, but also important. I think if I stopped feeling that frustration or lack or sort of tension, I'd be worried about my ministry. The one thing I don't really do is preach about LGBT things, mostly. In my parish, we're in a very, very deprived part of South London in many ways, a mixed area, but with great levels of deprivation. And for us, racism is number one on the list, and the same is true in my work. For me, that's much more important for us to be tackling in a church, but also I sit in a place where the church in which I'm working, living, blah, 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 it doesn't have a problem with sexuality, and they never have. And when I went to go and see the vicar, I said, my partner is, yeah, that's fine. And not just, yeah, that's fine, who cares? But yeah, that's fine, invite him to this, he must come to this. Blah, blah. So if I didn't live in that, if I wasn't able to exist in that kind of milieu where you have the support of kind of people ahead of you in this game, being willing to be visible, I think I'd find it more difficult. But it is tough. It's tough sometimes. I'll give you an example. I was on the bus about 2 or 3 days ago with my partner. And we sat down and we were holding hands or something, being tiresome. I saw a priest, a man, a couple of rows in front of me, and I thought, oh God, that was my first response. Ooh, what's he going to think? I still had that internalized feeling, and I'm afraid that's what happens when you get ordained as well. It becomes more internalized. But then I also thought on the way home, that could have been you in that position. That's what people might be thinking when they see you wearing a dog collar. So I think it's important to hold that all the time and be careful about how one sees oneself in the institution. But as I say, if I didn't think that change was possible or likely, I don't think I could do this. And if there is not, if we do not see something happening, I don't know how in good conscience, how long I can continue to celebrate the Eucharist publicly. To the extent that at some point, if we don't see any change, I would probably consider handing in my license. So yeah, it's tricky, but yeah. We try it, but no one should feel like they've not done the right thing by. It depends how you feel with your integrity. Some people feel like they can go into the. I don't have any time for people that go into the clergy and then persecute others. But everyone else, it's a grey area. It's tough. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I just wanted to raise sort of 2 definitional points. First of all, how we define the church. Secondly, how we define priesthood. To me, the church is all humanity, and therefore I think one needs to distinguish it from ecclesiastical structures, blah, blah, blah. Indeed, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, which means the religious leaders. Sort of point 1. Point 2 is again a theological point. I accept that the other thing about the Imago Dei is fine, but although we're in the image of God, we're the broken image of God. I mean, I think that broken bit is a very important bit that can get sort of swept away in woozy ideas that, angels are singing at my head all night or whatever. To me, the significant theological point there is that it is about the first and second Adams. And if you like, what we call male and female are the bifurcation of the full image. So the image is a broken image, and it's that needs healing, salvation, salve, blah, 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 all the rest of it. Last point, a Muslim asked me recently what the church was, and I described it as a sewer with a golden thread running through it. Thank you.
Yeah, how does one follow that? I mean, 2 points just to follow on 2 of the things. One of them is about the fallenness. So I talk a little bit about the fall in my book. I think the risk of following full theology, which I completely agree is part of the kind of theological narrative. One of the risks that we find is that we explain everything we don't like by calling it the broken part of humanity. So therefore we say, oh, well, we don't really like homosexuality, so therefore it must be an example of the fall because, and I'm not suggesting that's what you're doing, but I think that's the risk so we need to be really serious when we do our theology, when we make sure we ask ourselves why we're asserting certain things. And what, yeah.
To me, all sexuality.
Yeah.
The stigmata of the fall.
Fine.
It doesn't matter what orientation.
Fine. So, and I think the point about male and female is fascinating. So I love that verse, male and female, he created them, because it just depends on what your theological perspective is as to which bit of that you emphasize.
Yeah.
So do you emphasize male and female, two categories, that's it, he created them. Do you emphasize male and female, he created them, as in everything, he created them? Do you emphasize male and female, he created them? Where do we find ourselves theologically with that line? The Hebrew is interesting, but anyway, but it's an interesting point. But I agree with you that we mustn't throw out all that we know about or all that we've thought about theologically in order to say that same-sex relationships are right, and therefore that everything is good and that there's no brokenness in the world. I agree totally with that. Just in terms of your what is the church, I'm delighted to say that my next book, and this wasn't planted, but I have just finished a shorter book on the communion of saints. And I actually think this is a really interesting point. What do we mean by the church? And when we talk about the church, how are we defining it? And are we defining it by our own words and actions? Are we defining it institutionally? I think too often, I think in the book that I've written, too often we've spoken about things institutionally. So it's the survival of the institutional church, the bishops. We must survive. We must not lose our money because otherwise the church will die. No, it won't. If Jesus Christ was born, died, and was raised, the church will not die because it can't, because Jesus Christ is its source and its head. So that's why I feel quite relaxed about numbers, but that's another debate. But yeah.
You've talked about fear, and I'm wondering about big style fear. The Guardian's speak after the Lambeth Conference was gay sex is sin, at which point I nearly left the Church of England. How big is the fear of trying to keep in with the African churches and elsewhere who have a very different culture and history to our more liberal thinking here?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? And it's a tricky topic because it's very easy to kind of overgeneralize in a sense, and then you end up with a kind of, it becomes very kind of post-colonialist or colonialist. It's a big challenge. The first thing I say about Lambeth, so there was a lot of talk after Lambeth Conference about how unfair it was that the Guardian had said that was the outcome of Lambeth Conference, that gay sex is bad. It's not, by the way, but that was what they'd said. That's not what the absolute outcome was, but nonetheless, that's what people heard. Sandy Toksvig, in her letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury, spoke about this because that's what she heard. And it doesn't matter what we say, and it doesn't matter how many times we carefully thread ourselves through it, that's what people heard. And I agree. There's someone who I know who's very dear to me, who has left the Church of England because of what happened at Lambeth. Not gay, straight, who's left the Church of England, had said, I've had enough, I'm off. That was devastating to me because I thought, we're working against this, please stay. But no, that's it, it's gone. In terms of the fear with parts of the world where this is not culturally necessarily the same place that we're in. Firstly, I think the use of the phrase global south, which was used at Lambeth a lot, is misleading because it lumps everybody that's not Europe and North America into one particular bucket, which is just in itself a racist idea. But anyway, that's what was done. And I think also at Lambeth, there was a big political fight between the two different church factions in North America, between something called the Anglican Church of North America and the Episcopal Church of North America, or the Episcopal Church of the USA. And it's dead. No, it's not. Other people were being used as pawns in that debate. So I don't think it was as simple as was being said. But I think there is a question about how we engage with people in the Anglican Communion with whom we disagree. I think the way we engage with them is from a position of taking them seriously and treating them as adults, rather than as pussyfooting around. If we disagree with them, let's be honest. And there's too much in our current debate, which is essentially the rest of the world will get there, so we need to just play slowly and eventually we'll get there together. Now, I might believe that to be the case, but that is a Western and slightly imperialist perspective. So I think we need to be more serious about how we engage with other churches. But I think we also need to say to other churches, particularly, so I know the Ghanaian situation quite well because I've caused trouble on it, but also because we have a link with our parish with Ghana. The Ghanaian church supported a private members bill to criminalize homosexuality and indeed to criminalize supporters of LGBT people, as they wrote it in the bill, which was a confusing idea. And the church supported this. The church wrote behind it, we think this is a great thing, we should do this. In my parish, the people who came to us to say we need to stop funding the Ghanaian church were the Ghanaians. So it is not nearly as clear cut as we think it is. And something the Anglican Communion Office does all the time, which really gets on my nerves, there are many, but this is one particular, is it says, the Anglican Communion is made, the Lambeth Conference is made up of whatever, 300 or 700 bishops who represent over X number of million people. That's not what a bishop does. A bishop doesn't represent people. A bishop is the pastor, the chief pastor in their area. But I think we need to be much, much more aware that there are people in the rest of the world who are suffering, who themselves are LGBTQI, and we need to be willing to stand up and speak out for them. But at the same time, we need to take other people's theology on the terms in which they would want us to have that debate, which isn't as adults. And I feel that that's what we need to do much more, and we're not doing it.
Oh, that's loud. Gracious. Yeah, a minute ago you said the Hebrew is never mind, and I really want to know what the Hebrew is.
Busted. So basically, it depends what we mean by male and female. So it comes down to whether you, it gets weirder. It depends whether you buy the idea that the angels have no genitalia. So if the angels have no genitalia, and then, so for example, when it says, then they shall be like the angels, that's a suggestion that sex does not exist, that sexual differentiation does not exist. So it's back to the point that is the male and the female, what is the purpose of this male and the female? Is the male, do male and female have genitalia before the fall, for example? I know it's weird, but this is that's biblical scholarship. But these are really actually important questions because we throw around these phrases like male and female who created them, and we don't then engage with the underlying meanings that those phrases have within the creation mythology of Genesis, or rather, sorry, the creation mythologies of Genesis. So yeah, go and look up, do angels have genitalia on Google later, just not on a shared computer. Yeah.
There we go. Right. Hi. I've got a comment and a question. My comment would be, thank you, Charlie. We, being one of the older people, you never stop coming out. You never stop having to come out. And not so long back, I was at an evangelical gathering, and I was introduced to a senior person, and she went, "Oh, we are all sinners." She couldn't quite understand why I didn't find that welcoming. So that's the that's the context. Now, I'm really, really pleased that you're still hopeful and you think change is still possible. And I pray that it is. What can we do? It is, even if you're not a member of the Church of England here, this is the established church. It's your church too. What can we all do to push along the process ready for February? Should people be writing to Bishop Viv? What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think you should. The bishops have a vague and vapid, in my opinion, sense of unity. They think that they can make unity by being themselves and saying nothing. And when there's a terribly unfair description, which I'm sure will not be completely alien to all of you, which is that when you become a bishop during the consecration, they take your backbone out at the same time. And I think that's probably a bit unfair, because actually in the book I've spoken a bit about that the bishops, it's not just about the bishops, it's about the culture in which we ourselves, in a sense, possibly not, I don't want to victim blame in a sense, but that the Church of England more widely has developed as a culture of don't ask, don't tell, that's the safest way, that's how unity will remain, and the rest of it. So it's not just about the bishops, that's what we're asking of our bishops as an ecclesial body, as the Church of England, that's what we've asked of our bishops. So I think one of the things we need to ask of our bishops is to stop doing that and to start being honest and saying what they think. There are plenty of bishops, so the reason it matters is because in February, a direction of travel, if nothing else, will be brought to the Church of England's General Synod. That will be voted on, and at that stage, a decision of some form will be made. There is a potential, at last, possibly, for that to be a move towards blessings, probably, maybe a move towards a direction of travel towards marriage. Now, we can't blame all the bishops for this, we can't blame the bishops for all of this, because there's also something called General Synod. So not only should you be writing to your bishops, you should be writing to your General Synod reps, and you can find them on whatever, www.bristoldiocese.something. Write to them, because they will vote. And actually, there's only certain things that the bishops will be able to get through General Synod, because you need a 2/3 majority to get anything substantive doctrinally through. So that's the boring kind of politics of it. So write to them both. Your bishop could tomorrow, or rather today, or indeed when they were consecrated, could immediately stop taking away the licenses of same-sex married clergy. They could immediately stop demanding celibacy of their ordinands. They could immediately enable blessings for civil partnerships. They could do all of these things themselves. They are choosing not to. They're choosing not to. Every single bishop in the Church of England is choosing not to, out of a vain sense of unity, whatever that means. For those of you boring enough to know I think it's the Eucharistic prayer, where the priest says, reveal her unity, reveal the unity of the church, not create it. Unity is not a creation of humankind, but our bishops have made that mistake. So I would say, write to your bishops and say to them, this is what we need, and this is why we need it. Both of those things are important. If you all do that, that will be a substantial increase in Bishop Viv's postbag. And anyone that's not from Bristol should find their own bishop. And write to your suffragan as well, Bishop Viv and Bishop Lee, is that right? Write to them both. Tell them how it is. They need to hear, because they don't necessarily believe how painful this is for people.
Got a question here.
Yeah, just to follow up on from her question as well, I think she's focused on the institutional as a church and stuff as well. And I think I just want to ask a little bit, just focus on what are we doing now for people who are struggling and, trying to come out and stuff as well. Because I think earlier this morning as well, it was almost that I got a sense about is them and us, or the church and them. And I think, do you also see there's a path and there's hope for that to become one as well?
So to see, you might need to slightly rephrase that, just in terms of our pastoral mission as well as our institutional entity.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Because obviously institutionally, you can't do that. But what are we doing in communities now? Because I think, are we acting now already, or are we waiting for the church? And I think it's just, we can do things now.
Yeah. Okay, great question. I mean, so I always slightly bristle about the difference between pastoral and institution, because I actually think there's a huge amount of good stuff going on pastorally, and I'm sure a lot of you will know that there's a lot of good stuff going on pastorally. There are lots of seriously good pastoral, welcoming, affirming churches that will say none of the things which I've said the institutional church says, and say very positive things. And I actually think that's something we must do. My problem is that when we reduce it to that, when we say, well, I know the institution does X, but at least we've got Y on a local level, then the institution gets away with it. So at the moment, so in the parish I'm in, this ain't an issue. And it's just not an issue. So we would, if people are getting married, be delighted with them, we go along with that. We can't do it, but we'd nonetheless be partially part of it. We'd want to talk to them about their loves, their desires, their hopes, their dreams, the rest of it. So the church, there are many, many churches doing those things. The problem is that the institutional church ultimately colors that response. It says, yes, but. And so people come to us and say, well, can we, so we talk to them, oh, it's so great to have you with us as a couple. Blah. We have loads of same-sex couples in the congregation. So great to have you with us, blah, blah, blah. But I can't marry you. And the church then says, deeply disingenuously, I hasten to add, the church says, unfortunately, we are unable to marry people of the same sex. It says it on the Church of England website if you're dull enough to go and look. Why? Because we asked to be unable to do it. Because we lobbied to have it put into British law or English law that we could not solemnize same-sex weddings. So the church mustn't be let off the hook while still recognizing that there is lots of good that's being done pastorally. My question is, where does the pastoral end? Like, how do we engender good pastoral relationships when we have some churches that say sex between two people of the same sex is inherently evil and wrong and bad and a sin? We're all sinners. How do we engender a healthy sexual ethic within churches that are affirming, and how do we talk to people about that being what we're about? To be honest, I don't think the Living in Love and Faith project has been in many ways successful, which has been what the Church of England has done to engage with these issues. But the one thing it has done is let this out the box. And now it's out the box, we need to keep talking about how our Christian understanding, not our secular understanding, not our kind of second-rate, two-bit, who cares understanding, our Christian understanding is that same-sex love is a good, not that it is moderate or maybe might be okay. And move away, my book is kind of apologetic still. We need to move beyond apologetics to talking about the goods of same-sex relationships or of queer people in general. Yeah.
Just wondering if there are any other questions. I'm going to ask one. So we're in St. Paul's. We have a interesting relationship with our patron here. But it seems to me that one of the, no, I meant our patron saint.
Oh, sorry.
Well, our patron is the bishop. One of the things that I think Paul really helpfully discusses with the church in Corinth is their failure to discern the body of Jesus in the community of the church. And it seems to me that the church has, from that time onwards, done damage to itself by failing to discern Christ in its midst. I wonder what you think in terms of the damage that we've done to ourselves, to how we are the presence of Jesus in the world, and how we might go about moving beyond that damage, because it seems to me that if nothing else, the Church of England has become toxic brand.
Yeah, hasn't it? Poor old St. Paul. I mean, he didn't even write half of those letters anyway. It's very unfair. I tell you what, well, anyway, preaching on Ephesians, really. Ephesians is a marvelous letter. And then it kind of goes off a bit towards the end. And you kind of, I love preaching Ephesians 1, 2, 3, yes, 4, 5, oh no. So it's hard to pigeonhole St. Paul, and even if he even wrote it. Anyway, sorry, that's a by the by. Yes, I think the Church of England as an institution, and probably the church more widely, has done enormous damage in each generation by refusing to recognize the obvious in its midst. So last week, we had a talk by Elizabeth Henry, who used to be the Church of England's advisor on minority ethnic affairs. And Elizabeth left that job because she felt that things weren't happening. And I'm always happy to admit to my mistakes, and here's a mistake I made. I said to her, One of the really scandalous things, of course, is that the Church of England does not accept its involvement in the slave trade. And she said, I'm going to correct you. The Church of England was an architect of that, not involved. It was an architect. And she went on to give a number of explanations as to why that was absolutely the case. I put my hands up and said, I'm absolutely right. I'm absolutely wrong, sorry. The church got it big time wrong there and suffered for a long time and continues to suffer because of our history, our institutional history of colonialism and of racism. We're just doing the same thing again. And to me, this is not, and there are lots of different debates about the place of whoever the group is in the church or whoever the group is in society, but it always comes down to the same thing, which is basically they're not really like us. Or, I don't really want to give up power because power's a cake, and if they have a bit, then I'll lose a bit. And I think one of the big institutional and intrinsic problems to the church itself is that it sees power, A, as desirable, and B, as a cake. And each problem that we face as a church in terms of how we engage with other people is firstly to other them. And actually that was a helpful point because I often talk about the church as though it's something different. Of course it's not, I'm part of it and I'm, tough. And in a sense, but we other people. So we talk about a church for the poor or a church, what we are going to do for LGBTQI people. They're already in the church. They are the church. They're already the Imago Dei, tough. So one of the things we do is we other people. The other thing is that we see that cake and we're terrified that if we let go of a little bit of it and we lose the narrative, then we won't be in control anymore. And we're all like that. We're like that in every part of life. And I suppose one of the things that the church should be doing, and Paul even does this, is to make it clear that that is not how grace works. That grace is not a cake that gets cut into slices and you take as much as you can grab. Grace is total and infinite. And that, I think, is the lesson we need to learn as a church, which is why I think it's so important not just to see this in isolation as an issue of justice for queer people, but to see it as a reorientation of our entire theological method and understanding towards what the Bible says in the first place in Paul. So I agree that Paul is a pain, and he is a pain. And he gets very grumpy. I always read his letters as though he's had a really hard night. And he's just got up in the morning and gone, oh, I've got to write bloody Corinthians again. And he just writes this out. And just imagine being in Corinth, reading those bloody letters, like, oh, chapter 6, here we go. I mean, it just must have been a nightmare receiving this stuff. But I think Paul, at heart, in the context and everything else, speaks to that truth in a way which we need to hear again. And we need to make more of a focus on what it is that Paul is saying at heart, rather than focusing obsessively on the verses that make us feel better about ourselves and not give up the power that he himself tells us we must give up.
That feels like such a great place to finish this bit of the afternoon. I've spent the day being slightly chronologically challenged. The battery in my watch has packed up. The clock in the vestry is wrong. And my phone is being used as a camera. So can somebody tell me what time it is? 5 to 5, my gosh. Well, it's almost time for open table. But there's time in the meantime to go and partake of a cake or mince pies at least. And we promise they won't run out. Let's give Charlie a huge. I suggest that we start open table at 10 past. Give us 15 minutes.